Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. My name is Diana Skaya. The leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan have signed a peace agreement at the White House on Friday in a deal brokered by the United States into what Donald Trump called historic and said would finally bring 4 decades of bloody conflict to an end. Now, joining me now to discuss the details and what it means for the South Caucasus is Richard Giragosian, founding director at the Regional Studies Center. Richard, thank you so much for being with us here on World Talks this morning. Richard, we've been covering this story quite extensively all week. I've spoken to you quite a few times, and now we've really reached the finale here. Now, Azerbaijan and Armenia signed this peace deal that creates a Trump route in the region. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, can we actually call this a peace deal?
Well, actually, I would say no, because what we saw happen was pretty embarrassing. In other words, much of the White House ceremony was more about President Trump and his quest for a Nobel Peace Prize than it was about genuine, lasting peace. At the same time, what was actually reached was less a bilateral peace deal and more a culmination of negotiations between Armenia and the United States and Azerbaijan and the United States. In other words, this trilateral format rather diminished the outlook. But I'm also skeptical in terms of what this means on the ground. What we see is an accord or a diplomatic agreement that has no international guarantee or international guarantor. So I really think the premise going in is that this is still an agreement based on Azerbaijan's use of force. And given the lack of democracy, the authoritarian nature of Azerbaijan, I'm not sure Armenia has a partner for peace here.
You mentioned a lot of interesting things here, and there's so much I do want to ask you, Richard. First of all, I mean, we understand how Azerbaijan will benefit with this new transportation route. But I want to ask you, did Nikol Pashinan really use all he can to negotiate in this deal, or was he more pressured into signing this agreement with Trump and with Aliyev?
Well, I think the pressure was more from the nature of Azerbaijan's maximalist demands, continual and consistent pressure on Armenia. Having said that, I do think for the Armenian side, if there is a reciprocal element of this agreement, in other words, if this is more than giving Azerbaijan road and rail access through Armenia, but if it's also allowing Armenia to overcome isolation, then it is a victory. This is why what comes next is most crucial in terms of the day after. Whether Turkey will open its border with Armenia, normalization between Armenia and Turkey is the logical next step, as Turkey now has no reason to keep its border closed, but also in terms of the operational details of this road and rail. And the lingering question here is what will be Russia's response? Because the absence of Russia or any even mention of Russia is perhaps dangerous and reckless. Because after all, we do see Armenia is a member of the Eurasian Economic Union, a Russian-dominated trade bloc. And I do think the related pressure on Russia from the United States, after all, this event at the White House was coinciding with Trump's imposition of a deadline for Ukraine on President Putin. I do think the next reaction will be from Russia.
Is it safe to say that Russia, following yesterday's signing between Aliyev, Trump, and Pashinan, has officially lost the South Caucasus?
Well, I think it's been some time now that Russia has lost the South Caucasus. It remains distracted by its failed invasion of Ukraine. It's a position of weakness. But there will come a point where Russia seeks to regain its lost power and influence. And now that Georgia is moving away from the West and closer toward Moscow, Armenia is increasingly vulnerable and isolated as the front line of democracy in this region. as the last man standing, as the only democracy in the South Caucasus.
Richard, I want to take you through a quote that Trump used last night during his signing ceremony between leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan. He said, quote, 35 years of death and hatred, and now it's going to be love and success together. My question to you is, is this what the people of Armenia and Azerbaijan both think, particularly those who live on the border regions? I mean, it's one thing making, real estate deals and economic deals, but let's talk about the people. And also, was there any mention of prisoners of war on the Azerbaijani side? Or, of course, what happens to the over 100,000 ethnic Armenians that were forced into exodus from Nagorno-Karabakh following Azerbaijan's 9-month blockade?
Well, these are outstanding issues that actually tend to diminish optimism. But what we also see is, looking at President Trump's approach, the overall U.S. engagement, the sustainability, the American national interest, all seriously questionable. And what we see, for example, is it's the European Union, the EU, that's much more effective and much more engaged, having deployed monitors to Armenia, providing security assistance. And it's the EU and its member states, including Poland, which have provided much more key assistance rather than the rhetorical flourish coming from Washington. Having said that, I do think it is important to note what happened at the White House. This meeting between the leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan was an important sign of progress by itself, and it needs to be encouraged. But in the coming weeks and months, for much of the population, the test will be in the actions rather than the words.
Richard, how are some people in Yerevan? I mean, you're there in Yerevan right now, in Armenia's capital. How are Armenians reacting to this? Are there any news of possible protests, or how are people on the streets reacting?
Well, the Armenian population, since Azerbaijan launched its war in 2020, has become numb to this constant barrage of aggressive rhetoric, as well as the ongoing illegal detention of Armenian prisoners of war from Nagorno-Karabakh that are being held in Azerbaijani jails. What we see is an Armenian population that is sick of conflict, that seeks peace. But what we see is, what are the terms being imposed? Is this a punitive peace? And at the same time, it's based on a premise of a validation of Azerbaijan's use of force. And for the past several years, this is very much a victory of authoritarian Azerbaijan over democratic Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh. And in that context, the population is weary, but also wary.
Richard, I want to ask you about the corridor, if I can go back to Zangezur corridor, which reportedly will now be called the Trump route, right, for peace and prosperity. A report I read this morning in the media says that apparently it was the idea coming from the Armenian side. I don't know if you can confirm this or not, but now there's reports that the corridor and the negotiations on who will control it will begin next week. What does that mean, and what else do we know about, who will oversee the construction of that? Shouldn't it be the Armenian side, given the fact that it's located on Armenian sovereign territory?
Well, if there's one good news, if there's one good element coming from this flurry of diplomacy, it's that the agreement over the road and rail connections is no longer a corridor per se. In other words, Azerbaijan's initial maximalist demand of an extraterritorial corridor has been rejected. There is now an agreement reassuring Armenia's sovereign territorial integrity, and whatever road and rail connections are established and provided will no longer undermine Armenian sovereign control. So in this context, it is a step in the right direction, having de-escalated the war of words coming from Azerbaijan. Nevertheless, the operational details, as well as the construction, will remain subject to further negotiations. In fact, in the coming weeks and months, there's supposedly a plan for working groups to sit down and negotiate. And yes, this was an Armenian diplomatic initiative in terms of solving the dilemma of Azerbaijan's maximalist demands, saying that a third party or third country operating the road and rail network would be acceptable to Armenia as long as it doesn't undermine Armenia's sovereign control over the land itself.
Richard, do you believe that this summit that took place yesterday will actually mark the beginning of peace, really ending 4 decades of conflict? So do you think that a ceasefire, if that's what we can call it, will actually hold, given all the failed attempts in the past over 30 years?
Well, I'm optimistic because we are where we are and there is substantial progress diplomatically. However, I am worried about the day after. In other words, there's not much been done to ensure a lasting peace the day after these agreements. And what needs to be done is a return to normal in terms of ending Azerbaijan's demonization of Armenia. And like Armenia, Turkey, its efforts toward normalization. There needs to be people-to-people contact, confidence-building measures that have been missing. And much of the problem is none of these agreements do anything to address the initial causes of the conflict years ago, including now the forced expulsion of the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh does little to reassure the Armenian side that we have a good faith partner in Azerbaijan.
Thank you so much, Richard Giragosian, founding director at the Regional Studies Center, for all your input with us here this morning. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
And that's all for this edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm Diana Skaya. Thanks for watching.